So I'm gonna introduce the book. I'm gonna talk about the main themes of the book, but I think the best thing to do with this book is to read the first couple of pages to introduce it. So apologies to those who are already familiar. I'm gonna read from the first 2.5 pages, the first chapter, the first part. And the book is divided in 2 parts. It's set in Albania in the transition from communism to liberalism. And the first part is about communism, and the second part is about liberalism. And the first chapter, the first part is called Stalin. So that's what I'm going to read now. I never asked myself about the meaning of freedom until the day I hugged Stalin. From close up, he was much taller than I expected. Our teacher Nora had told us that imperialists and revisionists like to emphasize how Stalin was a short man. He was in fact not as short as Louis XIV, whose height, she said, they never broke up. In any case, she added bravely, focusing on what appearances rather than what really mattered was a typical imperialist mistake. Stalin was a giant, and his deeds were far more relevant than his physique. The thing that made Stalin really special, Nora went on to clarify, was that he smiled with his eyes. Can you believe it? Smiling with your eyes? That's because the friendly moustache that adorned his face covered his lips, so that if you only focused on the lips, you would never know if Stalin was really smiling or doing something else. But you just had to take one look at his eyes, piercing, intelligent, and brown, and then you knew. Stalin was smiling. Some people were unable to look you in the eye. They clearly had something to hide. Stalin looked straight at you, and if he felt like it, or if you behaved well, his eyes would smile. He always wore an unassuming coat and plain brown shoes, and he liked to put his right hand under the left side of his coat, as if supporting his heart. The left hand he often kept in his pocket. In his pocket? We asked. Isn't it rude to walk with your hand in your pocket? Grown-ups always tell us to take our hands out of our pockets. Well, yes, said Nora, but it's cold in the Soviet Union. And anyway, she added, Napoleon also always had his hand in his pocket. Nobody ever said that was rude. Not in his pocket, I said timidly, in his waistcoat. In his time, that was a sign of good upbringing. Teacher Nora ignored me and was about to take another question. And he was short. I interrupted. How do you know? My grandmother told me. What did she tell you? She told me that Napoleon was short, but when Marx's teacher, Hegel, I can't remember, saw him, he said one could see the spirit of the world standing on a horse. Hegel, she corrected. Hegel was right. Napoleon changed Europe. He spread the political institutions of the Enlightenment. He was one of the greats, but not as great as Stalin. If Marx's teacher Hegel had seen Stalin standing, obviously not on a horse, but maybe on a tank, he would have claimed to have also seen the spirit of the world. Stalin was a vital source of inspiration for many more people, for millions of our brothers and sisters in Africa, in Asia, not just in Europe. Did Stalin love children? We asked. Of course he did. Even more than Lenin. About the same. But his enemies always tried to hide that. They made Stalin sound worse than Lenin because Stalin was stronger and far, far more dangerous for them. Lenin changed Russia, but Stalin changed the world. This is why the fact that Stalin loved children just as much as Lenin was never properly reported. Did Stalin love children as much as Uncle and Bear? Teacher Nora hesitated. Did he love them more? You know the answer, she said with a warm smile. It's possible that Stalin loved children. It's likely that children loved Stalin. What is certain, dead certain, is that I never loved him more than on that wet December afternoon, when I scampered from the port to the little garden near the Palace of Culture, sweaty, shaky, and with my heart pounding so fast I thought I would spit it on the ground. I had run as hard as I could for more than a mile when I finally spotted the tiny garden. When Stalin appeared on the horizon, I knew I would be safe. He stood there, solemn as usual, with his unassuming coat, his plain bronze shoes, and his right hand under his coat as if supporting his heart. I stopped, looked around to ensure nobody was following me, and went closer. With my right cheek pressed against Stalin's thigh, and my arms struggling to circle the back of his knees, I was not visible. I tried to catch my breath, closed my eyes, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. When I got to 37, I could no longer hear the dogs barking. The thundering sound of shoes stamping on concrete had become a distant echo. Only the slogans of protesters continued to reverberate. Freedom, democracy, freedom, democracy. When I became certain of my safety, I let go of Stalin. I sat on the ground and took a more careful look. The last drops of rain on his shoes were drying out, and the paint on his coat had begun to fade. Stalin was just as teacher Nora had described him, a bronze giant with hands and feet much larger than I'd expected. Tilting my neck backwards, I lifted my head to confirm that his moustache really did cover the upper lip, and that he smiled with his eyes. But there was no smile. There were no eyes, lips, not even a moustache. The hooligans had stolen Stalin's head. I covered my mouth to suffocate a scream. Stalin, the bronze giant with a friendly moustache who had been standing in the garden of the Palace of Culture since long before I was born, decapitated? Stalin, of whom Henkel would have said that he had seen the spirit of the world on a tank. Why? What did they want? Why did they shout, freedom, democracy, freedom, democracy? What did it mean? So that's the end of the reading. And the question with which the reading ends is in a way the question of the book. What does freedom and democracy mean? And in a way the book doesn't really give you an answer. It tries to invite readers on a journey that explores this idea of freedom that appears to its different characters, sometimes as a promise, sometimes as a threat, sometimes as an ideal, sometimes as an illusion, sometimes as propaganda, sometimes as ideology, sometimes as aspiration of individuals, of collectives, and most of the time actually as betrayal more than anything else, and often as an open question. So the book is set in Albania, which is and was in many ways a limit case. So a limit case is what political scientists and economists call something called a kind of experiment or a thought experiment or an empirical case study when they want to test an extreme of a value. And it was a limit case both in its endorsement of communism and in its transition to liberalism and capitalism. It was a limit case because it was very isolated. It was a very isolated country. And as I was growing up in the 80s, I was born in 1979, and so spent the first part of my life, my kind of early life, under communism, and then came of age, so became a teenager in liberal capitalism. It was a very isolated country, and the founding belief of the state, which was also what shaped education and what shaped what was taught to children like me at the time around which I was writing about, and that shapes this kind of dialogue that you've just heard, was that Albania was the freest country in the world. And it was the freest country in the world because it was fighting for its dignity and for its freedom against these two mighty superpowers. One was the capitalist, imperialist West, so the United States, and the other one was the Soviet revisionist East, so the Soviet Union. So as you can imagine, if you're a child growing up in a society where you were in this tiny country, surrounded by everybody, all enemies, some of them have gone the capitalist way, some of them have tried to go the communist way, but betrayed everything and ended up compromising and sacrificing lots of people in their own countries, but also lots of smaller countries around them. And you are the country that's kind of defending freedom and the cause for freedom for the world. This is a very powerful narrative with which to grow up, and it's also one where it's easy as a child to internalize this idea that this kind of freedom is so hard to defend and to protect, that that's why we have to make all the sacrifices around us. And so when I was growing up, I knew that there was scarcity. I knew that there were queues. I could see that we didn't have everything. I could crave, like all my friends did, consumer goods from the West, like Coca-Cola or bubblegum wrapper or jeans or swimming costumes. I grew up by the sea. But these were the corruption and the temptation. they weren't the things that mattered. So I was convinced that, of course, they had these things that we didn't have, but we had something much more important, which was freedom and dignity. And that's what we were struggling to protect, and that's why we had to sacrifice. So the book is written from the point of view of a child who believes all of these things, and believes all of these things about freedom, and is a coming-of-age story because it tells you about the transition from this belief about freedom, which turns out to be a lie, into the promise of freedom that came to Albania in the 90s. And it's a story, it's a coming-of-age story because it tells you of this process of reaching maturity and trying to understand what does the world really look like and what are really values and what is freedom and what's democracy and so on. And it's a coming-of-age story both for the individual, so for this little girl who is growing up in this context, and for the country who is going through a similar transition from abandoning a system with a certain set of assumptions about freedom to entering this new system with another set of assumptions about what freedom is and so on. And in both cases, it's a relatively traumatic coming-of-age story. In the case of the child, and I always talk about the child rather than me because I often explain that even though the story is about me and it's grounded in my life and it talks about my parents, there's so much distance between me and that child that I'm not really sure that I'm the same person anymore. So sometimes I think that identity is a very complicated thing, and I'm not really sure how much we are even the same people that we were last year, let alone 30 years ago. So it's a lot easier for me to talk about the child rather than myself. It's only at the very end of the book that I feel like I recognize a bit more the author there. But otherwise, the child is actually a witness to these events and a witness to the dialogues and reconstructs all these different perspectives of freedom that surround the characters that she grows up with. And it's a witness to the changes of the country and tries to also tell you the story of a country that makes this transition from communist beliefs about freedom to liberal beliefs about freedom, and tries to talk about the conceptual changes and the mental adjustments that people have to make in the transition from one system to the other. But it's a relatively traumatic coming-of-age story in both cases, because in the case of the child grows up with these two main sites of influence on our lives and our education and on who we are. The family on the one hand and the state on the other. And so, you usually grow up thinking about who you are and what you believe in and what you care about. Usually it's the school and the nursery and the education system, television, the media that take you one way, and then the family also supports all of that. And in my case, these two went completely the opposite direction without me knowing it. So the first part of the book is about how the child grows up thinking that she's a future communist citizen and wants to be a good citizen and a good pioneer in what she thinks is a good country, and is brought up by the state to believe all these things and to feel like a valued member of the community, but lives in a family of anti-communist dissidents with a history of persecution and oppression that they conceal from her so as not to burden her sense of self and perspective in the world in which she's growing up with. And it was only when communism came to an end, and my parents were completely convinced that it had come to an end, and there was no danger that if they told me who they were and who my family were, that would affect me and my future and what I said in school, and they would stop being endangered. It was only at that point that I discovered that the class enemies that I had been taught to fight in school were actually the parents who had brought me up, and the grandmother and the family that I had grown up with. So again, it's a relatively traumatic coming-of-age story because it's almost like I always described it, and I studied philosophy after, as a kind of Platonic journey outside the cave. So for people who know the myth of the cave in Plato, and it's a myth that Plato, it's a story that Plato tells to try and talk about the difference between truth and appearances and real values and ideology and so on. It's a kind of journey outside the cave because in Plato's myth of the cave, there's all these people who live in a cave and they're prisoners, but they've never been outside the cave, and so they think that the real world is in the cave. And then at some point, one of the prisoners comes out and realizes that what he sees in the cave is actually all shadows, and that the real world is outside. It's the sun, and it's the forms, and it's the Platonic ideals, and so on, and that what he has lived with is this very pale shadow of what the real world is about. So for me, discovering all these truths about my family and so on was like a journey of a prisoner outside the cave who thinks that first they lived in the real world, so who thinks that first this was real freedom, and then emerges from the cave and discovers that actually this is not freedom, and freedom is something else, it's an ideal. So the first part of the book is that, and in some ways it's also a parallel transition goes on with the state, the people, kind of the collective. They go through something similar, so they are in this communist society, which is a society that indoctrinates them, that gives them all their values, their sense of belonging, their sense of self, and so on. And then they leave this world behind, and they know that this is an unfree world that they are leaving behind, and they're looking to the future and thinking, well, what is freedom now? And enter this process of transition with this hope and expectation around freedom. And it's a traumatic coming-of-age story in the case of the country as well, because those years that follow the transition, that kind of happen after communism has been abolished and outlawed, and the country is a pluralist society, also come with a cost for a lot of people. So the second part of the book is about the promise of freedom, but in many ways also about the betrayal of freedom in those years of transition in the 90s. And the book then follows the journey of a child who is actually no longer a child, is a teenager, and becomes an adult in this second half of the book, surrounded by this narrative that now this is freedom, now Albania is free, now we have the EU to look forward to, and we have this idea that everyone is going to be like the rest of Europe, and there's all these slogans of the 90s, while the reality around her is one of very harsh social processes that go on. One of them is immigration. So I grew up in a town in Albania, which is Durrës, which is the main port city in the country on the Adriatic Sea, and then spent my entire childhood looking at the other side of the Adriatic, which was Italy, and knowing that there was Italy and knowing that I couldn't go to Italy. And spent my entire teenage years watching Albanians leave to go to Italy and going through experiences of rejection as immigrants, of xenophobia, of stereotyping, of people who had been doctors and nurses in Albania, who ended up being cleaners and drivers, and doing very, very different kinds of jobs, trying to integrate in this other world that had been on the other side. I watched the fact that there were state enterprises shut down, privatization processes that left lots of people jobless, and who had to just make a living with whatever they could. And so, some opened small shops, some opened travel agencies, some became people smugglers, some became drug dealers, some were victims of sex trafficking. So all these things were all the results of this very traumatic transition. So what the book really asks is this question of what is freedom in these two different systems, and are there forms of oppression that might be different in these different systems, but that mean that in the end for these individuals the cost is so high that they never really find this freedom that they have been promised. And I started writing the book, and I'm an academic, and so my entire life before this book had been a life of political theory and ideas, and started writing this book about the idea of freedom, these different traditions of political thought. And then I was explaining, at some point I was asked, why did you write this personal story instead of writing this book about ideas and so on. I was in Berlin doing research for the book, and then COVID-19 happened, and I was in lockdown. I have 3 small children who were kind of following around and didn't understand why we were not always on holiday, why some people had to work, and I had to hide in this big cupboard in Berlin to write and to continue doing my research. And this is, so it was a large cupboard because it was a German cupboard, but it was still not a library. And it was in this cupboard that I started thinking about the fact that sometimes in our lives there are moments in which freedom is not that hard. And the lack of freedom isn't also very hard to notice. So you're in Berlin, you're in the middle of lockdown, kids can't go in the playground, you can't travel, you can't see your family, you can't meet your friends for dinner, and this is supposed to be one of the capitals of liberal democracy. And yet it's very obvious that there's a problem here. And so I started thinking about the fact that sometimes from our first personal experiences, we can tell that there's something going on in our lives where these big ideas that we always talk about are actually very obviously missing. So I started writing about freedom from this very personal perspective because it took me back to my life in Albania and to parallel times in which people had been talking a lot about freedom. There was a lot of energy and kind of collective questioning and ideas that we are now in a different system or things will never be the same again. You remember all of this discourse around the pandemic. So I started writing this book from the first personal perspective, and then it became very clear to me that if you want to write a book about freedom, you can't write it in a way that takes away the freedom from the reader. So I didn't, in the end, write a book that wanted to tell people, here's what I think about freedom. I wrote a book in which there were lots of conversations with lots of different characters, all of them in Albania, each of which had a different view of what freedom was, and had these conversations play out in the book in such a way that the reader would then ask themselves, what about me? Do I live in a free society? What do I think is missing? How do we ask these questions and so on? And so in a way that I felt that if you're writing a book about freedom, the last thing that you should do is write from a paternalistic perspective as an author who kind of knows what freedom is and is just telling the readers and lecturing, or as an academic who's been spending all their life researching freedom and is now lecturing people what you should do to feel free, because that kind of takes away the freedom of interpretation, which is in some ways the starting point for this quest for freedom. And so the book became what it is, and that's why it's a much more open-ended book than any of my other academic books, and that's why I would say, as a genre, it's a hybrid between literature, philosophy, history, all of which are there to illustrate these tensions about values that we all perceive in our lives, and that should shape the way that we ask ourselves questions about who we are in society, which we are, and how do we relate to other people. So that's